Hello, everyone. Jordyn Smith here, the voice in the astrologer for this YouTube channel, Nonconformist Conscience. This is the third installment of understanding the archetypes through evolutionary astrology. Archetype of all things third house, Gemini, Mercury. So let's start with understanding that the third house is coming out of the second house, Taurus, the Venusian energy. This is fascinating because that second house was yin energy, energy moving in. It's concentrated, it's all things sensual, understanding how one relates to oneself on an inner level. It's connecting with feelings, anything sensory, um, the values, the needs, everything I talked about last week. But out of that comes the third house and Gemini and Mercury, and that is yang energy. It's energy moving outwards. And this is fascinating when we think of how Mercury correlates with the left brain logical linear side of the mind. It's dealing with how we classify things, how we mentally organize different dynamics. It's speaking to what we're attracted towards in order to learn. Like, look at your own natal Mercury in your chart, and that will tell you like how you learn along with your third house, and what's on that cusp, its ruler, and also where Gemini is at in your chart. And all the aspects that are meeting, it really gives context to um, the ways in which we learn, what we're attracted to take, to go into learning, to what we're wanting to learn, what we're wanting to understand. It speaks to how we classify, construct things, how we define things within our mind. But the other dynamic is our mental processes dealing with this archetype um, really speak to out of the second house of Taurus and all things sensory and feeling. We have mental constructs that we all agree upon through whatever culture you're from. And that's looking at the opposition to Sagittarius in the ninth house. So, and it's also the inconjunct to Capricorn, to the third house, Gemini. So that's how we develop language that we all can agree upon. It's why different, countries have different languages. But what's fascinating is whenever we are wanting to logically organize or classify something, it first has to come from what we're sensing, what we're feeling. So I'm in a chair, I feel it, I'm sensing it, and from me feeling this and sensing this, in my mind, I'm affirming I'm in a chair. I'm labeling it, you know? It's how I'm mentally organizing everything that's around me. There's a dog laying on my sofa. It's on a sofa. I have a rug behind me. I'm in a room with walls. And that leads me further into this dynamic of from us sensing and feeling things, it ignites our perceptions and our thoughts and the ideas. So think about whenever you go out into the world and how you're sensing everything around you in your environment. And through that, ideas or thoughts come into your mind. It's like a very easy way to think about this. And then if we bring it into language, you know, we all are constructing things because we've agreed upon how we're labeling and classifying them, depending on the culture or the country that you come from. And so there's that dynamic with, Mercury, Gemini, and the third house. But this is also the ways in which we communicate and express ourselves. Like if someone has a Mercury in Pisces, they might be um, a nonverbal communicator. They might utilize their hands, which is Mercury, to draw, to write. That's another third house dynamic. Um, and then some people are more wanting to utilize their voice, the oracular. And that's because the third house in Gemini is dealing with the throat chakra. And so there's lots of different archetypes that fall into this house and sign and Mercury. I want to say that there's a couple of other themes. Through the square to Virgo, this can be where someone feels insecure within their own thinking or their own intelligence. Um, there's also the dynamic of opinion versus fact versus truth that is held within this archetype. Um, Sometimes a lot of like someone has a heavy emphasis on this archetype, whether it be their Mercury, the house, the third house, or Gemini dynamics, they can really be strongly holding on to how they classify information, and that's where their security lies. And so they can be very like rigid in their thinking is this archetype of this is a fact when it actually is not, it's an opinion. We can all rationalize, which is more of a Virgo, the inner expression of Mercury, um, our opinions and believe that it's, a fact instead of realizing or recognizing that it's an opinion. Um, and then there's like the truth, like our personal truth, which would be Sag, the ninth house, and then there's like the actual total truth, which is like Pisces. So it pulls in the mutable axis, which is really cool to think about because our thinking, Mercury, Gemini, third house, it this is that mutable archetype. Immutability is where we are able to be adaptable and think about how much we adapt our thinking throughout life. As we start to expand upon what we've learned, what we've come to know or understand, um, we adapt. We find more language, we learn more words to express or to understand, or sometimes we are confronted with our own thinking, our own biases, like an internal biases, and then we can make a choice to adapt. And that is like the dual nature of this archetype as well. This is really an archetype of duality, which also leads me into wanting to talk about how through the square from Gemini to Pisces, that sometimes there can be hiding. We're hiding who we are because there could be prior life dynamics of being judged, shamed, ridiculed, or persecuted for expressing ourselves or for being ourselves. And so we can start to live lives that have a dual nature to it. We're hiding who we are, but there's a duplicitousness, and duplicitousness correlates to the archetype of Gemini, which to me falls under the umbrella of cognitive dissonance. And that's really this kind of in conjunct to Capricorn or the trine to Aquarius, the air trine. This is an air sign. It's mental. That's what the air signs are. They're very mental. But duplicitous can come in many forms. Same with cognitive dissonance, falling under that umbrella. Like out of fear of being judged or ridiculed, we can hide but who we are, so we can show up in the world and present ourselves one way, but we know that we feel very different behind closed doors. I I actually experienced that. I talked about this in the weekly forecast video, I think, that I did recently, but there was a while where I started hiding who I was because I was afraid I was going to be judged. I live in Oklahoma, it's very Christian, and I am not a Christian. I love me some Jesus, but I am not a Christian, and I do not resonate with religion. I'm an astrologer, and I practice ritual work, and I love to be in nature, and I have very different thought processes than most of the people around me because of the nature of the society and community that I live in. And that's okay. But I, for a while, was presenting as a certain way. Like if you could have seen me 10 years ago, I would be in full glam and like long nails and dressed, decked out to the nines, jewelry, designer stuff. Like, I mean, it makes me laugh now. And I was hiding because I didn't want to be judged. So that essentially the duality, the duplicitousness, and the cognitive dissonance. I'm being someone that I'm not. This does not align with my values, and I know that it doesn't align with my values, but I'm gonna portray myself this way. Again, mine was out of like fear, judgment, persecution, all of that. Um, but essentially, this is where we can find someone if they have like this strong dynamic in their chart, especially if like they have something in their 12th house to go along with this, different signatures. This can be someone who is living a living lie. That's essentially what that I was doing. And I work with a lot of clients who have that dynamic going on in their chart. There are sole reasons for it. I want to be clear about that. The other dynamic around duplicity can be even darker. There are some people who, if they have this strong dynamic, um, can be people who, especially with the Pisces stuff going on, um, they can be what we would call like a silver-tongued devil. They'll tell you exactly what you want to hear. Um, all the while they're deceiving you. They're outright lies, and they are presenting them as actual facts. And they know that they're deceiving you. Um, so there can be a darker dimension of this, you know. So there's, yeah, there's that. And I want to say also, um, oftentimes I find people who have like strong Mercury, Gemini dynamics, third house is like they're needing to recover their voice. Like something happened, along the way, and they quit utilizing their voice. And someone that comes to mind that has some of this going on in their chart is Maya Angelou. You know, she was mute for 5 years at one point in time because she held grief around how she had a perpetrator, um, her mom's boyfriend, who sexually assaulted her whenever she was a little girl. And when she told her brother about it, and her brother told the family members, that man, he got arrested, but only for a day, and he got let out. And then, 4 days later, he was murdered. And she became mute for 5 years after that because she felt like saying his name, speaking his name is what killed him. So you can see there's all different kinds of dynamics that can come up, stemming from, trauma as well around speaking or expressing. Um, I see that a lot. The other thing that I see sometimes, especially like with Mercury retrograde or a lot of like the Pluto conjunct Uranus generation is, or if there's Pluto in the third house, Mercury retrograde, is that these people have taken in a massive amount of information in prior lifetimes, and they're absolutely needing to throw that information off. Um, Mercury retrograde can be someone who has a difficult time in traditional school settings. And it's because they're needing on a soul level to only focus on what is pertinent to their their growth in this lifetime. And so this can be someone who is learning things in school that they have a hard time paying attention to. They just tune out. And it's, the soul is setting it up that way. It's really trying to throw off that content because it's taken in an overabundance of information prior to this lifetime. And the other dynamic with Mercury retrograde is, as Mercury is that left brain logical linear, if one has taken in a lot of information and they are needing to throw off or resolve that dynamic through that retrograde, that Mercury retrograde in that person's chart, and even through transit, we see this, there's really more of an emphasis on concentrating on the right brain, the intuitive. At some point, we need to start to synthesize the information that we've gathered instead of continuously taking in more. And so that Mercury retrograde is really speaking to this recovering of the ability to synthesize or to have inductive reasoning instead of just deductive and information intake. And the other dynamic is, even if you don't have a Mercury retrograde in your chart, I want to speak about this. There's something called an oblique retrograde. I have this in my chart. And it's whenever a planet that is retrograde is aspecting a non-retrograde planet. That becomes an oblique retrograde. So my Mercury is in Capricorn and the ninth house, and it is being aspected through a trine by my Jupiter retrograde in the first in Taurus. And I definitely, growing up, I will tell you, whenever I was younger, my teachers wanted me to skip grades. It was because of my reading skills and my math skills. I taught myself how to read at a very young age. I actually have a son who has done that as well. I just picked it up like that. And then it was about fourth grade, I just started making really terrible grades throughout the rest of my school years. Like, I don't even know how I graduated high school, to be quite honest. I think it's because I jumped around from high school to high school, and they kind of just gave me credits. And what I will say is, when I look back in hindsight, I remember the feeling of this is very arbitrary. I've proven to you guys that I can do algebra, I can do math, I can add, I can subtract, I can do geometry, I know how to read, I know how to write, I know how to spell. And it was like I felt like tests and homework were very arbitrary. And I couldn't pay attention in class anymore after the fourth grade. I absolutely just, like, I could not. It wasn't that I was hyper or anything. I would just be thinking about other things and tuning out, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. And it's because it just wasn't pertinent. And then I went to college, and I remember I wanted to prove to myself that I could make good grades, and I got on the president's honor roll, made straight A's one semester, got accepted into like a prestigious program wrote a paper on how IQ doesn't matter and it's about hard work. And I never went back to college again. I don't even know what I got on that paper. I was just like, I proved to myself I can make straight A's, like I'm done. Again, it wasn't, I'm not saying this is like what people should do. But it wasn't what I was meant to do. And I, you know, I had a really hard time with traditional education. And so that's something that you can find happening. I think when I went to college with my Capricorn Mercury, I was like self-determined to prove to myself, that I could make good grades. But whenever I was like, there's nothing, I remember thinking, there's nothing here that I would ever want to do. Like, there's no degree that I would ever want. I just was like, screw this. So again, maybe, not the best thing, but it was my path. And that is part of that Jupiter retrograde aspecting that Mercury. It was really teaching me that I needed to follow my own authentic path that resonated with me and who I felt like I was, and not what was traditional Capricorn or society said was going to make me successful. And that was actually a really hard experience. I felt really judged. I was really hard on myself. I felt like something was wrong with me. Like, why couldn't I? Everyone else is doing this. And what I realized is like that as I got older, is it just was not for me. So there can be that dynamic with a Mercury retrograde or a bleak um, retrograde to one's Mercury. And I hope that for those who have that, that some of this might resonate with them and validate their experience. We're not all meant to have the same traditional path. There's something that's really beautiful and unique around our own way that we mentally construct different dynamics and how we express ourselves or the ways in which we think. I also want to speak to, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but Uranus is the higher octave of Mercury. So Uranus is, higher intelligence, and it's where we have ahas and um, ideas that flash in our mind, and it's like it speeds up our mental process. And it's like it seeds things into our consciousness from our own intelligence, from like our inner ether, and then we get to utilize Mercury, to start to put it into some type of um, you know, written or spoken form. Um, but that also leads me to want to tell you about the other archetype within Mercury. Mercury is our short-term memory, whereas Uranus is our long-term memory. And this is what's fascinating about Mercury with short-term memory, the duality or the dual nature of it, and also corresponding with opinions, facts, and truth, is that we can experience the same thing as someone else. I think of siblings often. Siblings, by the way, is the third house, Gemini, twins, even just siblings in general. But if you have a sibling, um, I'm sure, I feel like this is a universal experience. You two had some type of dynamic that happened. You both were right there. And then later on, you're talking about it. And your siblings like, that's not what happened, or that's not how I remember it, or this or that. That's one, because our short-term memory is corresponding to the ways in which we take in information and we classify it or we construct it in our mind, and it's our perception, and utilizing our mind. And one person can feel like that's how they're remembering it through their short-term memory, through their Mercury and its placement in their chart and its aspects as truth, when really both people are reflecting truth, but it is just their truth and how they experienced it. And so it creates that duality of really showing us, you know, that different people experience and logically construct things from their own experiences in a different way. One person can remember it this way because it's impacting them differently, and the other person can remember it the other way because it's impacting them differently. So, yeah, I want to make sure that I'm not missing anything else whenever I'm going over this. Other thing, I love archetypes. If these are more just kind of instead of the psychological archetype of this, just to throw a few things out. Mercury Gemini is also rail systems. It's, mail. It's uh, forms of communication. It is short journeys. Long journeys would be Sag, ninth house. Again, it's like writing is the third house, whereas publishing is the ninth house. Siblings, neighbors, running is another dynamic. You see people who have a strong emphasis on Gemini, Mercury. They could be someone who likes running, especially like Mars and Gemini. Um, or these are people who like to use their hands in different ways. This can be playing tennis. This can be an artist. This can be a massage therapist. It just kind of depends on where Gemini, Mercury are in your natal chart and what your third house is doing. But I've seen a lot of different interesting sports activities dealing with people's hands, like an emphasis on their hands, that have a strong Gemini placement. Either, Venus in Gemini or Mars in Gemini, oftentimes is what I see with people who are into sports and they utilize their hands, like basketball players, uh, tennis players, people like that, people who run track, Mars, Gemini, you see this kind of play out. Artist, you see usually like a Gemini moon or a strong third house influence, with like a twist of Pisces, Venusian energy as well. When you see artists who, um, painters, writers, anything in the arts. There's uh, speaking. Um, you'll see this play out in their chart. Today, the chart example that I'm going to be utilizing is Martin Luther King Jr.'s chart. And I want to start with his evolutionary stage and give you some background information. This is a soul who is in the third stage of consensus, moving into the first stage of individuated. So he really reflects the archetype of transitioning from the third stage of consensus to the first stage of individuated. So I need to speak a little bit about both because he reflects both of these, the duality of these two these two stages of evolution. So in the third stage of consensus, this is someone who's rooted in the overall consensus, belief systems, laws, taboos, regulations. Religion is a really big part of the third stage of consensus and consensus in general. So if you have someone, in whatever country they're from, whatever that country's philosophical, religious, cosmological value system is based on, that person is going to be rooted in that religion. Here in America, it's Christianity. And so you'll see that in a third stage consensus soul. It's also someone who has reached the top of the social stratosphere. So this is where you find political leaders, although sometimes political leaders are not in the third stage of consensus. Sometimes they can be in the individuated stages. But you'll also see CEOs of companies, corporations, and you'll see religious leaders, which is exactly what Martin Luther King Jr. was. And in the first stage of individuation, that's where someone is starting to liberate from consensus thinking, beliefs, values, and is really liberating from more of the temporality of that and starting to move into or understand more spiritual values, beliefs, and meaning, and that are rooted in natural, timeless laws. And that's where it's just starting to happen and take shape. And so the underlying core theme of that first stage of individuation is this is someone who is really starting to think for themselves. It's that dynamic of objectification. Is this really what I think, or is this what I have been taught? And so they're wanting to understand their individuality through the individuation process of what is actually true for me and who I am identifying or how I'm identifying through my individuality. And something that you typically see in that first stage of individuation is it can show a hiding signature in the chart. It can also show someone who appears really consensus, but there can be that duplicitous factor of they know that they aren't necessarily aligned with the same values, needs, beliefs of the consensus. But they will appear that way. And it can be when someone is writing that cusp of the third stage consensus to first stage individuation, that can be someone who they'll have that hiding signature and there can be a duplicitousness because there can be a fear of expressing their individuality as they're coming to understand it, because they understand that the consensus can be very self-righteous. Um, this is the only way, this is the right way to believe, to think, to what to value, what to mean. And it can be a scary time for those souls who are on that cusp because they don't want to experience trauma around being their own unique individual self. Um, I also, just as a side note, before I get into the background of MLK, so just so we know that he really shows kind of both the third stage consensus, first stage individuated signatures, hasn't really made it into the first stage of individuation yet. At that tail end of the third stage consensus, starting to individuate. But something I will say that you'll see in the first stage of individuation is these are the souls who start to get really into a lot of times new age practices, um, like astrology, tarot, um, these kind of dynamics. And oftentimes, these are people who do it in secrecy. They don't um, they don't let anyone know that they have an interest in it or that they practice it. And that's something that you'll find in that, first stage of individuation. Again, it goes back to they appear very consensus. They appear like they're living a very consensus life, but behind closed doors, they could be really into astrology, or whatever. I had a client at one point, lives in a different country. Father was a religious leader, and this client was really active in his father's church. But what he told me is that, I mean, first off, he was coming to see me, and then he opened up about how he's really into tarot and but he would never let his family know. That's someone who's like just entering that first stage of individuation, but is still kind of hiding. And it's something really typical that you see. So I wanted to let you guys know that. So let's get into, now that you know where MLK was in his evolutionary journey, I'm going to talk a little bit about him. So just some of the background, I'm sure most of us know about him, but I want to give a little bit more information. He was an American Baptist minister. He was an activist, and he was a political philosopher. And he was one of, if the biggest civil rights leaders, part of the civil rights movement that started around 1955 and then into, the late 60s, early 70s. Um, he grew up, he was born in Atlanta, Georgia. His father was a minister. Um, his parents were pretty harsh whenever it came to punishments. There were stories that he told around how his parents, would um, hit the children, and even one time, like, and then the parents would even have the children hit the other children as punishment. There's even this story of his dad allowing, I believe, one of the siblings to do that to his daughter, or he did it, and he thought that the daughter was dead, and he was in so much anguish that he got on the roof of his house and jumped off and didn't kill himself, was on the ground, heard his daughter crying, got up and ran inside. And that was like a pivotal moment for him around that type of punishment. Um, a lot of MLK's early childhood dynamics were such a catalyst for the work that he ended up doing for the civil rights movement. Um, there was a story about how he became friends with a little boy who was white, and they would play together. And one day, the little boy's parents ended up telling Martin that we are white and you are black, you are colored. I hate that word, by the way. It's a discriminatory word, but I'm just saying what the quote is. And you know, the parents told him that he could no longer play with their child. And he said that he told this to his parents. Um, and he said how that he told his parents, and he said that he reflected on that, made him really determined to hate every white person. And what his parents did whenever he said this is they ended up telling him the history of slavery and racism in America. And then they, told him that um, as a Christian, it was his duty to love everyone, no matter what. He also witnessed his dad standing up um, against discrimination and segregation. Whenever he was younger, he relayed a story that one time they were in a shoe store, him and his father, and after his father was discriminated against by the people who were working at the shoe store, that his father told him, I don't care how long I have to live with this system, I will never accept it. So there was an extreme defiance to the system that they found themselves in through society. Um, and then, his dad also early on um, led a bunch of African Americans in a civil rights march to the city hall in Atlanta to protest the voting rights discrimination. And this was also really pivotal for Martin because he said that that was a day that he realized and recognized that his dad was a real father to him. Um, And there's lots of themes that he reflected on in his life about how he felt whenever he was a child, that he felt resentment against white people due to racial humiliation, always feeling humiliated and having to watch his friends, his neighbors, his family be racially discriminated against, and watching them feel and experience the humiliation and the injustice that occurred. And then this was something that also made him have a lot of doubts around religion whenever he was a teenager, especially like the emotionality is what he said whenever it came to religion as well. And then what he was seeing, it made him kind of question what God was in a religious context. And then later on in high school, he actually won an oratorical contest where he talked about racial discrimination. And he had said, in that speech that Black people still wear chains and that they are at the mercy of white people. Um, he also said whenever he was in high school, he was like on a field trip with one of his teachers, and the bus driver wanted him to give up his seat, and he refused at first. And his teacher educated him that, if you give up your seat, if you keep doing this, this is illegal, you could be arrested. And so he did what the bus driver wanted him to do, and he said that this was a day that he looks back on where he's never felt more enraged than he had ever been. Um, he graduated from high school at 15 years old, and then he went on to attend Morehouse College. It's a historical Black university where his dad and then his maternal grandfather both had attended. He graduated from there at 18, but before he did, he realized that he wanted to be a minister because the president of that college was like a spiritual advisor and teacher to him, and or a spiritual mentor. And through that relationship, he understood that being a minister was a way for him to have the ability to communicate to people in his community, where it could be a place of understanding ideas around social unrest. And he really had this urge to serve in this way. And that was a time period where he realized that a lot of his doubts around religion were, going away. Before he went to ministry school, he met his wife, Coretta. They went on to get married and have 4 children. He enrolled then in ministry school, and he was elected student president during that time. After school, him and his wife, they settled in Montgomery, Alabama. He was a pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He was very instrumental in the Montgomery African American community, and he started to become very well known and respected for the ability to express and through his preaching. And so people even around the surrounding area started to come and listen to him because he was talking about things that were relevant and that resonated to his community of African Americans. The ways in which he rose to prominence was in 1955. Rosa Parks wouldn't give up her seat on the bus, an experience that he was very, he had himself. And when she refused to give up her seat and she was arrested, this ignited something in him, and he became extremely strategic in rallying the community together to get on board with an effort to boycott the bus system. And this boycott lasted for almost 400 days. And what this did is it led to a Supreme Court ruling that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. And this also proved his own inner knowing and theory that nonviolent protest could work, that they didn't have to fight violence with violence. He went on to write a book, and at a book signing in 1958, he was stabbed. He, survived that. His house was bombed at one point in time. There's so many different dynamics of violence against this man, even though he was always peacefully protesting, which is ironic to think about. In 1963, this is where he delivered that 17-minute speech known as the I Have a Dream speech. This was the March on Washington. He also participated in 1965, the Selma voting rights, which was known as Bloody Sunday. And I want to make sure that I'm covering everything else. I don't want to forget anything. Something to know is, the FBI investigated him. The FBI sent him a letter where he felt like they were trying to get him to commit suicide. Another thing that the FBI did, this was J. Edgar Hoover, who was running the FBI at the time, sent his wife, because they were surveilling him, he sent his Coretta package with the videos of him having liaisons, affairs with other women. Something else to note is he was jailed over 20 times throughout the civil rights movement for peacefully protesting. He was Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1963. He, you know, got the admiration of JFK. He was also the youngest person to win the Nobel Peace Prize for combating racial inequality through nonviolent resistance. He delivered over 2,500 speeches, wrote over 5 books, and he had numerous articles throughout this time period. And then on April 4th in Memphis, Tennessee, after he did his final speech, I've been to the mountaintop. That's what it is. So on April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, he did his final speech titled, I've Been to the Mountaintop. Whenever he went back to his hotel that day, he was on his balcony and he was assassinated. And what's interesting is the family has always felt like they scapegoated the man who was imprisoned for MLK's assassination. That was a man who was on the run, who escaped prison, and the family felt like, the FBI scapegoated this man and that there was something darker going on. After MLK was assassinated, there was a lot of aftermath. There was a lot of race riots that ended up happening. And, this is a soul who, how he went about communicating, expressing things that were rooted in giving, sharing, inclusion, equal rights. We all have heard the lines of the I Have a Dream speech. We've all heard and understand and know who MLK was, what he stood for. And we also know that his legacy has taken on a life of its own, even after his death. So let's look at his chart and really go over the third house Gemini Mercury dynamics going on in his chart. Of course, I'm going to bring in just a couple of other things to really speak to some of the archetypes in his chart, especially because he's writing that third stage consensus, first stage individuated place within his evolutionary journey. So MLK has a great chart to demonstrate this third house Gemini Mercury dynamic. It's very strong in his chart, and I'm going to point out these signatures and how we look at this. And, in evolutionary astrology, we always start with Pluto, the moon, and the nodes. And so I'm going to point out these signatures first, and then I'll really dive deep into this so that way you can understand this archetype further. So, he had Pluto in Cancer retrograde in the third house, ruled by a moon in Pisces in the 11th. Cancer is on the third house cusp, also ruled by that moon. Gemini is on the second house cusp. He also has this Mars retrograde in Gemini in that second house, and that is ruled by his Mercury in Aquarius in the 10th house. Of course, you've got the South Node in the 7th, ruled by that Pluto, and the North Node and Venus in Taurus retrograde in the 1st. So South Node is ruled by that Pluto. North Node is ruled by this Venus that is conjunct the moon. And then another notable mention is when we're dealing with evolutionary astrology, we're needing to look at if there's a skip step, and he has that with Neptune retrograde in Virgo and the fourth house square to the nodes. It's also ruled by this Mercury. And the resolution is this north node and the first house ruled by that Venus. So I'm going to stop this and I'm going to speak about all of this to you. And I'm also going to funnel in a couple of other things. But you will have, I will post his chart beside me as I talk so you can follow along. Pluto in the third house, retrograde in Cancer, this is someone who in prior lifetimes has been working on, especially with Cancer on that third house cusp, understanding how to become emotionally secure through taking in a variety of different types of information within his environment. And with Pluto ruled by that moon in Pisces in the 11th house, there's been this need for him, Pluto retrograde, to relive and re-experience past situations where he would become disillusioned through, what he was experiencing and learning about his environment. The environment is Cancer, and how that affected his sense of security on an emotional level, and where through the moon and Pisces, there could be these really disillusioning experiences of, not understanding why inclusion was not happening. And inclusivity is a 11th house Aquarian Uranian dynamic. So you can see that he was really trying to understand his environment as a way to gain security, and how this actually perpetuated a lot of insecurity and emotional and spiritual trauma within, because of what he was seeing and the information he was taking in at that time and prior lifetimes. The next thing we want to do after Pluto is we want to look at his skip step, which is that Neptune in Virgo retrograde in the fourth house square to his nodes. And this really speaks to how there wasn't, yes, he's been working on that Pluto dynamic in the third house in Cancer, trying to find security within through even understanding himself, right? On a deeply emotional level. But that Neptune in the fourth house, it speaks to, this Cancer energy as well. It's in the fourth house, but how, again, Neptune is also the ruler of that moon. There were these disillusioning situations, not only through the environment that he found himself in, but it was also where he experienced guilt and shame around being himself. And that Neptune retrograde is truly about needing to liberate from these dynamics. He was going between, that south node in the seventh house and the north node and the first house, and not really being able to heal these emotional dynamics of where he became disillusioned through persecution and the guilt and shame that he was taking on that was being learned, right? It wasn't natural, it was being learned through others' projections, through community and society's projections around who he was. So that resolution node is the north node in Taurus, and the first house ruled by Venus and Pisces in the 11th. There's a need to recover becoming secure within oneself on an emotional level, and really utilizing that Neptune to heal his inner relationship to self, and to also have the courage to be himself. even within his community. And, with Venus ruling that North Node and Neptune ruling Venus, there was this dynamic of needing to be a group of one if necessary sometimes. And the ways in which he was doing that was he was liberating from the disillusioning experiences of guilt, shame, persecution, and, survival issues around these dynamics. And he was really called to initiate a higher calling and a higher purpose. And you can see that with Neptune being ruled by Mercury in Aquarius in that 10th house. It was really about having this personal voice of authority in order to help his community, Aquarius, to liberate from oppression within society. Oppression and society is that 10th house, and you can see how that's working out in his chart. The other thing is when you look at where Gemini falls in his chart, it is on the second house cusp. It's ruled by that Mercury as well. There are inner resources that this man had through prior life efforts in order to have a specific social role of purpose and higher meaning that he was carrying in to this lifetime through prior life efforts. And it was around his ability to speak, his use of writing sermons and having amazing oracular skills. Mercury, Gemini, third house, that really spoke to a deeply emotional place within his community. It hit them right in the gut. And the other thing that I want to say about that Neptune retrograde in his fourth house in Virgo is right work, not working for work's sake. It's where someone can be needing to have purposeful work, where one can be of service to the whole. And when you pull in Pisces and Neptune, that's where we find higher meaning. And again, it goes back to the ruler of, his second house cusp and the ruler of his Neptune being that Mercury and Aquarius in the 10th house. He was speaking for the community of people who were oppressed. Another dynamic about the 10th house, Capricorn and Saturn, is that corresponds to skin color and races. And you can see that he was wanting to liberate his community of African Americans, people who had darker skin color, who were being oppressed by society. And he was doing it through speaking in a way that really resonated with the collective unconscious. And that's part of that Neptune and the Venus and the moon and Pisces in that 11th house. The collective unconscious is Pisces and Neptune. And that moon is ruling that third house and that Pluto. So you can see that he truly was recovering the skip step, that North Node. He was aligning himself with values that were timeless, and he was utilizing his own inner resources through prior life efforts around his writing and speaking abilities to be able to help the community in order for them to liberate. And it was through higher meaning and being a steward of these people, of being of service for them. Other dynamic that I want to speak about is that Mars retrograde in Gemini in the second house. It is ruled by Mercury and Aquarius. This is someone who was needing to throw off a lot of old intake of information that had affected his sense of self, and to also implement the values that he was learning through his own personal truths as a way to speak for the whole, things that were natural, but he was really needing to understand his own anger dealing with this as well. And Saturn is opposing that Mars, and Saturn is in that 8th house. He was truly needing to throw off past belief systems that even affected his survival, second house, and prior lifetimes. I'm also going to say that this is someone who Jupiter is in the 10th house. It's in Taurus. It's ruled by that Venus and Pisces. Jupiter in the 12th house can sometimes be someone, especially in Taurus, willing to die for what they believe in, for what they know is true. And you can see that that is something that did indeed happen in his life. But when we also funnel in Mercury and Aquarius in the 10th house, ruling that Mars retrograde, again, it's wanting to speak for the community, wanting to liberate a collective of people from oppression. And that Mercury is, ruled by Uranus and Aries in the 11th house. And that facilitated this dynamic. 11th house, Aquarius, Uranus are subconscious memories. And you can tell with his Uranus and Aries in that 11th house, ruling that Mercury, that there were subconscious memories of acts of violence towards his community. And what he ended up doing is he utilized this dynamic to harness the anger, Aries, Mars, that he felt in a productive way. He utilized his own will, Mars, Aries, to break new ground for the African American community. And how did he transform his anger? Uranus and Aries, ruled by Mars, Gemini, retrograde in the second house. Well, he did it through peaceful protest. Peace is Neptune and Pisces, that Venus and Pisces in the 11th house ruling his north node, which is part of his skip. It's the resolution to his skip step with Neptune and Neptune ruling that Venus. He transformed his anger in a way that gave him drive and had the courage, Aries, to speak for the oppressed, but to also reflect, project 11th house, peace. This is the path. This is how we do it. And that was really where you see him actualizing his abilities to communicate and to express all things Gemini and third house. And that also was helping him to not over-identify with prior experiences on a deeply emotional level that affected his sense of security, stemming from the violence of projections and prior lifetimes, or, having to live through violence. Think about what ended up happening to him over and over and over and over again. He was peacefully protesting and he had acts of violence. And now I want you to think about this. Mars is retrograde in Gemini. It is the ruler of Uranus and Aries. There were subconscious memories that he had of acts of violence against his community that he was needing to throw off, that dealt with his inner relationship to self. Retrogrades, Mars retrograde, Neptune retrograde, Neptune in Virgo. He still relived being persecuted, being humiliated, being disillusioned. But he harnessed that ruler of his Mercury to have the courage and the will to continue to go on. And that was through giving higher purpose and meaning, through peacefully protesting, for being the voice of reason, for speaking these timeless truths about how all men are created equal. You even think about his speech, I have a dream. A dream is Pisces. He's literally speaking this. I have a dream that one day that brothers who were enslaved can sit at the table with the brothers of those who used to enslave them. Slavery is Virgo. You can see that he lived through that in a prior lifetime. You can also see that he was resolving that dynamic of persecution, humiliation that he even experienced as a young child, Neptune in the 4th house, where he experienced being enraged about these dynamics. And he harnessed it in a way to promote peace later on. That Mars retrograde, Mars deals with knives, it deals with guns, it deals with violence. And you can see that he relived those experiences. His house even got bombed. Uranus and Aries, no matter what, he kept focused and had a lot of self-determination. That's his Capricorn sun, by the way, to continue to do what he was called to do. By the way, being a part of, Pisces, Virgo, Neptune, Mercury can be Judeo-Christian dynamics, and Sagittarius can be like the preacher, who is, you know, speaking. It can be dogma, but the preacher can also be this Virgo dynamic. So you can see that he had these skills from prior lifetimes and he relived the same dynamics that he did in his previous lifetime. But this time, even though he relived acts of violence, he was resolving it by grounding within his own will, Mars in the second house. And he was willing to die for what he knew was a truth, for what he believed, Jupiter, Taurus, and the 12th. In my personal opinion, the signatures that I've spoken about in his chart really reflect that before he reincarnated as MLK, he knew on some level what could happen to him, but he was willing to spiritually martyr himself because he knew that his teachings and what he stood for would take on a life of their own. That's an 11th house dynamic, but he became an icon, which is a Pisces dynamic. And he did this in humility. He did it not just for himself, but for everyone. He did it for the culture, he did it for the community, he did it for the oppressed. And you can see in his chart with that Jupiter in the 12th and the Pisces dynamics, Neptune retrograde, even Mars retrograde, ruling that Uranus, that he was willing to die for community, for culture, for others, if it could liberate them from oppression. And the tremendous amount of strength and will that he had to continue to keep going on when acts of violence were happening to him is momentous. I don't know how many people would actually do that, but it's also a demonstration of he knew that there was an absolute higher purpose and higher meaning, and he was hell-bent on doing what he came here to set out to do. So there's that. The other dynamic that I want to say is I find it interesting that he felt like one of the notes that were written to him by the FBI or the government were trying to push him to commit suicide. And he's got that Saturn in his 8th house. It's ruled by Jupiter in the 12th, and he's got Neptune retrograde in his chart and a skip step with the South Node being in Scorpio in the 7th house. It makes you ponder and question if he experienced massive amounts of disillusionment and futility in a prior lifetime, and he didn't get to do what he needed to do in that lifetime. And so he showed up in this one and was very determined to make sure it happened. So I hope that this helps you really understand the ability of expression, the communication, how Gemini, 3rd house, Mercury can show up in someone's chart. And I do feel like MLK through resolving that south node is definitely well on his way to fully entering that first stage of individuation. Just a beautiful example of a chart. And this is kind of segueing off of this, but I've been thinking about kind of what's been going on in the world and how there's so much divisiveness and like people getting angry. You voted for this person and you should have voted for that person. And really understanding and looking at MLK's chart and him having a Mercury in the 10th house and then all of his Pisces dynamics too, it made me, he gave so much of his community hope. That's the Pisces in the 11th. But he did it through compassion and grace and nonviolence. And he really harnessed his anger in a way that was transformative, that brought people together. And it makes me think about what's going on now with divisions and how if we had compassion for people, even if they've bought into something that is now impacting others, at some point in time, some people are going to be disillusioned through crisis and understanding that they made a choice that wasn't what they thought that it was going to be. And I just really hope that we take a page out of MLK's book, and when people come forward and they are honest and they are wanting to atone for their choices, that we meet them with compassion instead of blame, shame, guilt, and judgment, because we've all made choices that we wouldn't want to make again, that we learned from, where we became disillusioned. And to follow in the steps of MLK, he brought community together through being compassionate. And at some point, we're going to really need to bring community together because of the various things going on. And I really feel deeply that the path to doing that is through compassion and understanding and love. Pisces, that's like ultimate love. And not alienating people for their choices, especially whenever they're realizing that those choices are having a bigger impact than they understood or they knew, or they're experiencing disillusionment because they're recognizing that what they believed, what they thought was in fact a lie. Whatever. I just hope that we extend forgiveness and we don't shame or judge people. And hopefully it can unify and help to rebuild community in a way that is rooted in timeless, compassionate love and forgiveness and understanding. And utilizing MLK's chart just really touched my heart, especially whenever I was researching him. Of course, I knew who he was. Of course, I learned about him in school. Of course, I had researched him before, but it just hit home in a different way. So, okay, I'll get off of that soapbox and I will go over, um, you know, transits through the third house for you all. So, when we have different planets transiting the third house, and I can talk about this in a general sense, just like with every video that I've done before this and after this, dealing with the archetypal nature of the house, it's going to be very generalized. It really depends on what's on your third house cusp, its ruler, where your own natal Mercury is, what sign, Mercury transiting through that house is, and also what it's aspecting within your natal chart. So very generalized sense. I'll give an overview. Mercury transiting through your third house can really be where you are looking at different types of your own thought processes, how communication skills, the ways in which you express yourself through writing. Um, it can also be a time where you can feel like you're wanting to learn more about, take in more information that's dealing with the sign that Mercury's in that third house, that and what's on your house cusp, and also the house cusp ruler. It can be a time where there could be more arguments with others depending on what transiting Mercury through that house is aspecting. And the reason being is because it's wanting to pull in that polarity point of the ninth house for us to expand upon our knowledge. As we gather, we can information, we can be confronted with where there's limitations in our own thinking. And that can happen through our conversations that we have with other people, can really get us in touch with, where we're viewing things as fact whenever really it's an opinion, or it can just be this time where we get ignited with interest again around the dynamics that are on that house cusp, and we're wanting to all of a sudden use that to take in more information around that area of our lives, again, depending on what's on that house cusp and whatnot. Venus through the third house can be a time where we're really looking at how we relate to ourselves and others through the ways in which we have constructed, contextualized our thinking around our values and our needs. It's a time where we could be learning more about our inner relationship to self through communicating with others, through contrasting and comparing. This is what you think, and that's how you relate, and this is what I think, and this is how I relate. And so it can get us in touch with, how we've classified our values, and it can also be a time where we're learning more and discovering more about our inner relationship to self, and it's becoming a type of inner knowledge for us. Mars through the third house can be where we are initiating new patterns and new choices around our thinking and our types of expression. It can be a time where we're having new desires come up around what it is that we want to learn and how we want to learn. It can also be where we're cultivating new patterns around our thinking and our ability to communicate. It can also be where we have desires to now learn something new because it's pertinent to some type of desire on a soul level. So there's like this need to really start to speed up the process of our learning. It can also be where all of a sudden our thinking becomes faster, or all of a sudden we're, having desires to take short journeys, short trips, because whenever we move or we take a trip somewhere or we visit somewhere, we get to experience different dynamics and we get to learn about things in a new way. So that can pop up. Jupiter through the third house is where we can really be expanding upon our knowledge. It can be also this dynamic of where we're desiring to find a teacher in order to learn more, in order to study. It can also be where we're looking at our limitations and our beliefs around the ways we've, constructed our thinking that correlate to our belief systems. It can also be a time where we travel and we take long journeys in order to learn about cultures. Culture is Jupiter, Sag, ninth house. So it can be this expansive type of energy in that third house. It's also where we can be learning about whether or not we're overcompensating through our intellect. Jupiter has a dynamic of compensation. It can also be a dynamic of where we are wanting to learn how to synthesize or utilize our intuition to synthesize the information that we have gleaned in the past, and we're wanting to expand upon it through synthesizing. It's also where we can be understanding what feels authentic for us and wanting to lean into learning uh, about different dynamics in our lives that feel authentic to each one of us. Saturn through the third house, okay, is where we are deeply looking at how our mind is conditioned, how we're wanting to structure our mind or how our mind has been conditioned. What type of learned conditioning have we, experienced? It's also Saturn can be where we're needing to hold ourselves accountable for our own opinions and thoughts. It's also a time where we can be looking at the nature of our judgments stemming from our conditioning. And it can also be where if you're someone who picks up a book and doesn't read it, only one or two pages, it's really teaching one about being self-determined to finish some type of learning. It's also where one can start putting a foundation together of what they've learned. And it could be for work, or it could also be this time where you're learning more about family dynamics or your own authority or your own authority figures in your life and how that has had an impact on uh, your voice, your ability to express. Um, your opinions, all of that. So, yeah. Then we have Uranus in the third house. That can really be where we are trying to liberate and deconditioning from all types of thinking or mental constructs. It's also a time where we could have deep insights and ideas around what it is that we want to learn. It can be a time where all of a sudden we're recalling subconscious memories to learn more in order to think about, what does that mean or why did that come up? And it's also speaking to this dynamic of liberation from the past. All things Uranus is about liberation from the known. It can also be a time where we are absolutely confronted with where we've over-identified with different types of learning, thinking, opinions, and we're needing to individuate more. We're needing to think for ourselves, or we're needing to observe our own thinking to understand, is this unique to me, or is this what I have been taught? So there's that. It can also induce a lot of frenetic energy. The mind can be really, really quick, and it's almost like you can't keep up with your mind. And there's just so many ideas and so many bursts of insights. And so that would be a time that you would definitely want to like write things down because they could be pertinent to the future. Neptune and the third house can be where we're trying to culminate all types of dynamics dealing with our mental constructs. Or if we've been hiding, or if there are idealism or idealistic beliefs that have been learned and we're needing to dissolve those dynamics. This is also a time where we can find inspiration through our own mental constructs, or to start having visions, around what it is that we've been learning about. And all of a sudden, it's given higher purpose and higher meaning. And so we can have a dream about how to utilize that throughout our lives. This can also be a time where you're learning about some new type of spiritual modality. This could be anything from yoga to all of a sudden you're wanting to learn about, Hinduism, or, anything, anything that feels pertinent to your own natural way of spiritualizing. And then, you know, Pluto through the third house can definitely, it's all about penetration into the mind of your thinking. It's also where we're confronting our own limitations around this dynamic. Is this who I am? Is this not who I am? Is this who I absolutely cannot be? How does this tie into my thinking? It can also be a time where, someone who's usually docile is all of a sudden having a lot of arguments with people because it's confronting their own limitations in thinking. So it's all about this confrontation at a mental level, and that can be through arguments with others or this or that to really throw oneself back in on themselves. And it's in order to look at how the mind is deeply connected to one's emotional psychology. And it's wanting to metamorphose those limitations within around the mind. So I hope that this helps. And yeah, I hope that all things Gemini, third house, Mercury, have been helpful for you guys. Definitely comment if you want. As always, I love having conversations about this stuff, and it's perfect for the third house Gemini. Let's converse if you want to.